According to the World Bank, 6 of the 10 fastest-growing economies in the world over the past decade have been in Africa. Ethiopia averaged 9.4% annual growth from 2010 to 2019. Rwanda hit 7.2%. Ghana, Côte d'Ivoire, Tanzania, all posting numbers that would make developed economies weep with envy. But here's the thing. If you ask people living in these countries whether they feel dramatically richer than they did 10 years ago, you'll get a lot of confused looks. Poverty rates in many of these places have barely moved. In some cases, they've gotten worse. So what is going on here? We have economic growth that looks incredible on paper, and yet the lived experience of millions of people suggests something else entirely. It's like watching a speedometer claim you're going 100 miles per hour while you're clearly stuck in traffic. So let's look at a few key questions. What actually counts as economic growth? Who's capturing these gains? Are we measuring the wrong things? And what's the real disconnect between macro success and whether people can afford dinner? Cool. So let's start with what GDP growth actually means, because I think a lot of us, and yes, I'm including myself here, have a pretty fuzzy understanding of this. GDP is basically the total value of all goods and services produced in a country in a given year. When we say a country's economy grew by 7%, we mean that number got 7% bigger. Sounds straightforward. And if you're watching this video, you probably think, well, if the economy is bigger, people must be richer, right? Well, it would be if economic growth worked like dividing a pizza. Imagine 3 people, 3 slices, everyone's happy. Economy doubles, now 6 slices, everyone gets 2. But that's not how it works. It's more like the pizza got bigger, but 2 of the 3 people are still fighting over crumbs, while the third person somehow ended up with an entire second pizza. Consider this. Nigeria's economy grew by an average of 5.4% annually in the 2000s. Impressive. But during that same period, the number of Nigerians living in extreme poverty, defined as less than $2.15 a day, went from about 69 million to over 100 million. The economy got bigger. The number of desperately poor people also got bigger. Both things can be true. And before anyone says, well, that's just Nigeria, what about the success stories? Kenya's economy has grown consistently since 2010, averaging around 5% annually. Mobile money revolution, tech hub of East Africa, all that good stuff. Yet as of 2020, about 36% of Kenyans still lived below the poverty line. Better than some neighbors, sure, but hardly the prosperity story the GDP numbers would suggest. There are a few things going on here. First, population growth. If your economy grows by 5%, but your population grows by 3%, well, you're only really 2% richer per person. And many African countries have some of the highest population growth rates in the world, so you're essentially running to stand still. But that's not the whole story, not even close. Because even in per capita terms, where we account for population growth, the numbers don't add up to people feeling much better off. So what else is happening? This is where we need to talk about inequality. And I already regret it because this is where everyone gets mad. But here's the thing. If economic gains are highly concentrated, you can have impressive average growth while the median person, the person right in the middle, sees almost nothing. Think of it this way. You're in a room with 9 other people. Everyone makes $10,000 a year. The average income is $10,000. Now, a billionaire walks in. Suddenly, the average income in that room is about $91 million. Did you get richer? No. Did the average go up? Absolutely. This is an absurd example, but it illustrates how averages can mask reality. In many African economies, the Gini coefficient, which measures inequality, where 0 is perfect equality and 1 is one person has everything, is incredibly high. South Africa sits around 0.63, one of the highest in the world. But even in countries with strong growth, inequality often increases or stays stubbornly high. When that happens, GDP growth becomes almost meaningless for understanding the typical person's experience. Let's talk about what's actually growing. A huge chunk of Africa's recent GDP growth has come from extractive industries: oil, gas, minerals. Angola's economy boomed in the 2000s almost entirely because of oil. Same with Equatorial Guinea, which had some of the highest growth rates in the world while most citizens remained desperately poor. Here's the problem with resource extraction. It can generate massive GDP figures without employing many people or spreading wealth around. You can have a billion-dollar oil operation that employs 500 people and funnels most of its profits to foreign companies or a tiny elite. On paper, GDP goes up. For the average person, nothing changes, or things get worse if resource wealth corrupts governance or drives up costs elsewhere in the economy. It's worth noting that this isn't unique to Africa. Plenty of oil-rich countries have the same problem, but it's particularly pronounced in places where institutions are weak and wealth concentration is already extreme. There's actually a historical parallel here that's kind of depressing. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, many Latin American countries experienced commodity booms. Rubber in Brazil, nitrates in Chile, coffee in Colombia. GDP figures looked spectacular. Foreign investment poured in, and yet, for most people, not much changed. The wealth got extracted, often literally, and flowed to either foreign companies or a tiny domestic elite. Institutions that could have channeled that wealth into broad-based development never materialized. Some economists call this the resource curse. Others call it the Dutch disease. Whatever you call it, the pattern is depressingly familiar. Natural resources create GDP growth that doesn't translate to development. Am I saying Africa is doomed to repeat this? No, but I am saying we've seen this movie before. And the ending usually isn't great unless there's active intervention to ensure resource wealth funds things like education, infrastructure, and diversification. Now, I know what you're thinking. Okay, but what about the African countries that aren't resource dependent? What about Ethiopia or Rwanda? Fair question. Ethiopia's growth has been more diversified. Manufacturing, agriculture, services. That's better, right? Well, yes and no. Ethiopia's growth has been heavily driven by massive state-led infrastructure projects. Building a dam employs people and adds to GDP. But if that project is financed by debt that the country struggles to repay, and if the jobs are temporary, and if the benefits flow mainly to urban centers while rural poverty persists, then you've got growth that looks great in the aggregate, but feels hollow to a farmer in the countryside who still can't reliably feed her family. And here's where we get into the measurement problem. GDP measures economic activity, not economic well-being. It counts what's produced and bought, but it doesn't capture whether people have access to clean water. But there's another measurement issue that's huge in African economies: the informal sector. According to the International Labor Organization, informal employment represents about 85.8% of employment in Africa. That's not a typo. The vast majority of economic activity happens off the books. Street vendors, subsistence farmers, informal services, cash-based transactions that never get recorded. Here's the problem. GDP tries to capture this informal activity, but it's incredibly difficult to measure accurately. You can't exactly survey everyone selling fruit on the street corner or doing informal construction work. So statistical agencies make estimates, and those estimates could be off by a lot, which means our GDP figures might be undercounting real economic activity, or they might be capturing formal sector growth while missing that the informal sector, where most people actually work, is stagnating or shrinking. It gets weirder. Sometimes people shift from informal to formal work, and GDP goes up even though the person is doing essentially the same job for the same income. A street vendor who gets hired by a registered company shows up as GDP growth, even if her actual earnings barely changed. We're measuring formalization and calling it growth. What's worse is that GDP can actually increase when bad things happen. If there's a disease outbreak and healthcare spending spikes, that's economic activity. GDP goes up. If deforestation accelerates to fuel construction, that's activity too. GDP is morally neutral, just counts stuff. So, are we measuring the wrong things? Probably, yeah. Or at least, we're putting too much weight on one metric that was never designed to capture human flourishing. There are alternative measures: the Human Development Index, multidimensional poverty indices, inequality-adjusted metrics, but GDP growth is what makes headlines and what politicians campaign on. The disconnect between macro success and lived experience also comes down to where growth happens and who benefits. If economic gains are concentrated in capital cities, in specific sectors, or among those already wealthy, then national statistics become almost meaningless for understanding what life is like for most people. I'm sure the comments will be full of people saying, "But corruption," or "bad governance," and yeah, that's part of it. When public resources get siphoned off by elites, when infrastructure projects become vehicles for graft, when resource wealth funds private jets instead of public schools, growth numbers become particularly hollow. But it's not the only thing going on, and reducing this entire phenomenon to corruption misses some important structural issues about how we measure prosperity and how modern economies distribute gains. Let me tell you where this gets really complicated. Some economists argue that we need to be patient, that growth has to happen first before it can trickle down to broader poverty reduction. They'll point to countries like South Korea or China, where rapid economic growth eventually did lift huge numbers out of poverty. The counter-argument is that those countries had very different institutional setups, land reform, investment in education, and policy approaches that actively tried to spread gains. And this is worth unpacking a bit because it's a fundamental debate. China lifted something like 800 million people out of poverty since 1978. Incredible. But China's approach involved massive state investment in manufacturing, deliberate policy to keep rural migration flowing to cities, huge infrastructure spending, and yes, authoritarian control that enabled rapid decision-making. South Korea did land reform in the 1950s that broke up huge estates and created a more equal starting point, then invested heavily in education before industrializing. The question is, can African countries replicate this without those specific historical conditions? Can you have broad-based development without land reform when land ownership is highly concentrated? Can you industrialize when global manufacturing has shifted toward automation? Can you invest in education and infrastructure when you're already heavily indebted? Maybe, but it's not obvious. There's also a timing question. China and South Korea industrialized when global demand for manufactured goods was surging and labor-intensive manufacturing was the path to development. That window might be closing or already closed. Africa's trying to develop in a world where robots do more and more manufacturing, where service economies dominate wealthy countries, and where climate change is going to hit hard. The playbook that worked in the 1960s to 1990s might not work now. So, what does this all mean? I think it means a few things. 1. GDP growth is not a useless metric, but it's a profoundly incomplete one. It tells you something about economic activity, but very little about whether people's lives are actually improving. 2. The type of growth matters enormously. Extractive versus productive. Concentrated versus broad-based. Sustainable versus debt-fueled. And 3. We probably need to stop treating national GDP figures as the primary measure of success and start paying more attention to things like median incomes, poverty rates, access to services, and inequality. Is Africa's economic growth story a success or a failure? Honestly, it depends on what you're measuring and who you're asking. For investors and some urban elites, it's probably been great. For the hundreds of millions still living in poverty, the macro story hasn't translated to micro-reality. Both of those things can be true at the same time. The best part is, and I mean this with maximum irony, we'll probably keep celebrating high GDP growth rates, even while acknowledging they don't capture what we actually care about. Because changing how we measure success is harder than just running the same numbers again. Anyway, that's the paradox. Economies growing, people still poor, and a measurement system that was never really designed to reconcile the two.